Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in tonight. We're going to do a brief, I say brief, it might be a little bit lengthy actually, so that's sort of not a great word for that. We're going to do a lecture on ancient China, Central America, and Oceania. So let's get going here. I think we covered some of this in class, but just to fill in the gaps and make sure that you're prepared for your exam, we're going to go through it again, and then you have this as a recording if you want it for later. So, the geography of China, only about 12% of the land is arable. That means suitable for growing crops. We've talked about geographic barriers to human migration, and there are many of those in China, such as rivers, mountains, things like that. You have Mongolia, the Mongol Empire up here. And a lot of Chinese society, as with many ancient societies, they emerged along the rivers. So that was common because you need water for growing crops, irrigation, fishing, even travel. So we're just going to go through some dynasties very quickly. The Shang dynasty is the second known Chinese dynasty. The first one is Xia, which is actually not on this PowerPoint. I don't think there's a lot of it. You might have one question about that. The first dynasty is Xia. It's XIA, and there's not a whole lot of documentation for that one, which is why there's just not a whole lot to say because they didn't have written records. Very little pottery or anything exists to document them. So really, the Shang dynasty is the first one that we know a lot about. Chinese society under the Shang was agricultural, and it was ruled by an aristocratic class. Now, remember, we talked about hierarchies. Social hierarchies were common in the ancient world in nearly every urban society. And so you can kind of see here, they have a king at the top. Then there's nobles, there's upper nobles, lesser nobles, including scholars and peasant farmers. Now, remember that the people who are in the hierarchy represent what was important to the society, and you're going to see that very clearly as I'm going to go through several different societies. This is the one for the Shang dynasty, right? So the king obviously was at the top. He had a bureaucracy, and I think that's important to mention because we have a bureaucracy in the United States today. All of those three-letter agencies like the EPA, the CIA, the DOT, all of those three-letter agencies are bureaucratic agencies, and they sort of get a bad rap, right? When you think about like the DMV, I think of that movie Zootopia, where they've got incredibly long lines, and they have animals serving as the officials, and they're sloths. Do you remember that movie where they're sloths and they're just moving so slow, and it just looks like a miserable place? But I think it's important to say that bureaucracy happened in the ancient world just like it does in society today. It really is just like it's people who help the ruler, right? And so a lot of these bureaucratic agencies in America, they're lumped in with the executive branch. They help the president. And in the same way, you had officials who helped the king in ancient China. So you can kind of liken those two things. If you look at the ancient Egyptian hierarchy, you can see that Egypt had a much more complex structure. It's similar now. They had the pharaoh at the top, right? And so you have these officials and priests and nobles, but then you have scribes. Which I guess would be sort of like the scholars, right? But a little bit different. And then you have skilled artisans and craftspeople, showing that art was important to Egyptian society. Peasant workers and farmers were next, and then servants and slaves down at the bottom. So when you have more levels like this, it just shows that society is more complex. You have more things going on. Art and architecture were important. Not that you didn't have art and architecture in China, but it was produced on a different scale, and it had a different value in terms of the social hierarchy. India. You can kind of see here, you've got your priests and academics at the top, right? So rather than a king, and notice the kings are on the second level. So this shows that in the Indian society, religion was more important than political power. It was more important than the warriors. And then you have the merchants and the landowners next, commoners, peasants, and servants, and then the untouchables down at the bottom. Now, in some of these hierarchies, what you'll notice is that you have farmers up near the top. And so that just shows that they realize, you don't have a society if you can't eat, right? And so that just sort of shows us that they valued agriculture and they valued good food. They valued the ability to grow crops and things like that. So, oracle bones. What are oracle bones? Um, they are evidence of Chinese writing. And so in China, they don't have letters with phonetic sounds, they have characters. And there are many, many more characters than we have in letters. And so they each, once you learn how to read these, you pick up on it pretty quickly, but it's definitely a different system, right? And so the main purpose of an oracle bone was communication with the gods. They hoped that they would have divine intervention. After the death of a ruler, ritual sacrifices were made. Human sacrifice was also made. Sometimes this was, like in ancient Egypt, they, they would sometimes kill the servants and bury them with the noble or with the king because he was supposedly taking them into the afterlife with him. And so you have the same things going on in other societies. You just don't hear about it quite as much. And also veneration of ancestors. If you've seen the movie Mulan, you see ancestor worship in there. So that was also common in Chinese society. So, farming villages were the basic social unit. Villages were usually families, and a lot of times it would be like aunts, uncles, grandparents, the children, obviously. And they all lived together in these individual dwellings. So there was definitely a emphasis on the nuclear family, and that's what made up your society. Now, moving on, you've got the Zhou dynasty. It looks like Zhao, it's pronounced Zhou. And so this was from roughly 1045 to 221 BC. The longest lived dynasty in the history of China was the Zhou dynasty. The king was at the top, and so below him you have ministries, education, law, public works, things like that. Members of the hereditary aristocracy were appointed by the king to govern the principalities, and everyone was under the king's authority. Now, this is where the mandate of heaven comes in. This is important because this goes on for many centuries. Uh, Basically, it's the idea that the king was chosen by the gods, right? The king was a representative of heaven, but he wasn't considered divine. So he wasn't a god himself, but you couldn't be king unless the gods had chosen you to be king. That's sort of what the mandate of heaven meant. And if the king did not appease the gods, that would mean he failed in his job, right? And so then he could be overthrown and replaced, making his position somewhat pliable. Yeah. And so you've got the well-filled system. Peasants worked on the lands owned by the Lord. They cultivated a plot. I would kind of liken this to if you've ever seen in your subdivision or a friend's subdivision where you've got a community garden and everybody gets a little plot. You can grow vegetables or whatever. That's kind of what this is. And farming became more advanced during this time. So you have the iron plowshare. Fertilizer began to be used. You have irrigation, the technique of leaving the land fallow. That's actually a biblical principle that, the land is supposed to rest every seventh year. And so just things like that, farming became more advanced under the well-filled system. Confucius, and this is a question on your the religion section of your exam. Born in the state of Lu, the man named Confucius was a real person. He was born in 551 BC. And so he was a philosopher and author of a book called Analects, and he promoted the idea of a rational order to the universe and placed great emphasis on human behavior. So that brings us to some religions here. So you've got Confucianism and Taoism. Well, what is the difference, right? So the term Taoism is derived from the poet Laozi. And so he translated, well, there's a book called Classic of the Way and Virtue. And so in a nutshell, Taoism is described as polytheistic or somewhat so. I had a student at Georgia Highlands who really was adamant that Taoism is not a polytheistic religion. And I guess it depends on how you look at it. Are we deifying objects or not? Because if the objects are deified, it would be polytheistic. And if they're just objects that happen to have mystical powers from the gods, but they're not gods themselves, then I guess it would not be polytheistic. And it depends on who you are and how you see that, right? And so, but the yin and the yang is the symbol, which I'm sure you've probably seen. It's on lots of jewelry and things like that. But Taoists believe in life after death. They don't recognize one creator. And so, like I said, the polytheistic nature of it is debated. Now, here's what you really need to know. The main goal of the Tao is to achieve balance in life, whereas under Confucius, it was more about social relationships, right? So, balance in all of life, balance in relationships, harmony with nature, or family comes first. You see the social structure, or, harmony with nature is everything. The Tao is the main God or the way. Good and bad have to be balanced through the yin and the yang, and women were respected as mothers and nurturers of the universe. Whereas over here, you're looking at family, social relationships, social balance. It was patriarchal, but women had respect, and there's not really a deity, but worship of ancestors and Confucius was common practice. So here's a little map of where things evolved. You got Taoism down here in the south, Confucianism up here, Shintoism, which I'm not going to go into this particular lecture, was from Japan. So legalism was very important because it highly impacted the social structure of Chinese society. Now, legalists disagreed with Confucianism. And as I said in class, I know I've said this many times about various societies, there must be separation of church and state. When you have too much intermingling of church and state and you force the religion on people, society typically doesn't go well. Right. And so here you have this situation where everyone was sort of adhering to this Confucianism, mainly because it was just what they did and it's what they enjoyed and it was who they were, part of their identity. And then you have the legalists who come in and they argued that human beings were by nature evil, and they would only follow the correct path of human behavior if they were coerced into doing so with harsh laws and punishments. And so all of these new laws were implemented to create an orderly society. Well, that brings us to the Qin dynasty. So this is from 221 to 206 BC. You can see it was very short-lived. And the first emperor was Qin Shi Huangdi, and so he was ascended to the throne at age 13. Legalism was established as the official ideology of his dynasty, which may be why he was so short-lived, because Confucianism was reigning supreme. But they also had bureaucracies. They actually organized their bureaucracies a lot more than they had been in the past, and they put them into three ministries. So you have civil authority, military authority, and a censorate. Below them, you have two levels of local governments, provinces, and counties. Now, the Qin society was based on weights and measures as far as economics was concerned. Their money looked like this. It's kind of cool. They put it on a string, which is why it has these little squares in the middle. It was sort of a laissez-faire society in a way, but private commercial activities by merchants were restricted. They were heavily taxed, and the government had a monopoly on some industries. So that brings us to the Han Dynasty, 202 to 221 BC. And so after the death of Qin, you have this new dynasty emerging, right? And so the rulers of the Han abandoned the harshness of legalism, and you're back to Confucianism. And what you find typically in Chinese society is when they followed Confucianism, things went pretty well. And that's kind of true, like for ancient civilizations across the board. If they just followed one religion and it wasn't a sinister religion and it kind of adhered to some positive qualities, it actually did improve society. Now, I wouldn't say that that means that they're saved or anything like that. As far as like us as Christians, we believe there's one way to heaven, right? But just to say that other religions can promote good things, but they're not the same thing as the sacrifice of Christ. Just kind of put two and two together there. So state Confucianism began to reign supreme under the Han Dynasty. The Han government was headed by a grand council. So you have representatives from three separate segments of government, and the province and districts were under direct control of local governments. So in 165, they implemented the civil service exam, and they created a school, the academy, to train the best candidates for certain positions. And this really actually improved society quite a bit because they were well educated on what civil service should look like. They were educated on how things were supposed to run, the history of the country. And, it's almost like taking a citizenship test today, right? If you want to be a good citizen, know and understand your government. Yeah. And so that's what this was. So the Han economy, I won't read all of this, but basically trade expanded during this time. This is when the Silk Road was implemented. The Silk Road, silk was only able to be made in China because you can only grow certain kinds of trees. And this was the leaves that the silkworms would eat, and they would spin these elaborate little, silk cocoons, and those were used for making silk. And so when other countries got word of this like really great commodity, then they started traveling to China to buy it, which created the Silk Road. You also had waterways and things like that that expanded trade. But the silk was probably the biggest industry during this time. Here it is, Silk Road. You can see it goes all the way from the Roman Empire, all the way almost to the edge here of China. Okay, so the family unit was a key structure of society in ancient China. The concept at the center of the family was the idea of filial piety, which called on all members of the family to subordinate their personal needs and desires to the patriarchal head of the family. 5 relationships were key to maintaining this order. So the son was subordinate to the father, the wife was subordinate to her husband, the younger brother was subordinate to the older brother. Imagine that now if you have a younger or older brother. And friends maintained a proper relationship, and everyone was subordinate to the king. So you have just basic housing, wooden planks. So, what you'll find is a lot of these primitive tribes where they made homes out of adobe and thatch and things like that. So whatever they had available is what they used. Mud, wooden planks, bricks, cave dwellings were common. Usually everything was pretty simple. You didn't have a lot of furniture and things like that. And as we're talking about ancient society, historians typically cover gender roles. And so in ancient society, it was just common for things to be patriarchal. The men worked in the fields, the women raised the children. In some cases, men were permitted to have more than one wife. They could divorce if there was no male heir because that was considered very important. Women could not own property, and there was no dowry system at that time. Men were the warriors and scholars and ministers, and they carried on the rituals of ancestor worship. So, bronze casting began to be used during the Shang dynasty, and these are some of the most ornate objects. Shang bronzes were the pinnacle of creative art in ancient China. So, rather than to have elaborate pyramids or statues or the Sphinx or anything like that, they had cups and things like this. However, they also had these terracotta warriors, which were very essential. You've probably watched a documentary. There have been many documentaries made about these. So the terracotta army was intended to accompany the emperor into the afterlife. And so this took the place of actually murdering the men. He could take their statues instead, which I'm sure they very much appreciated. So, ancient Chinese language is based on these oracle bones, which I've kind of already talked about. I'm not going to cover this again, and there's not a lot on your test about it. Um, just understand that, they don't have phonetic letters in China. So, as you evaluate this particular lesson, think about the differences between the major Chinese religions. You've got Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism. Class hierarchies of ancient China, even as attempts were made to promote based on talent, birth, and wealth, continued to play a prominent role. And gender roles in ancient society were important, especially in the family relationships. So that brings me to the Americas. I'm actually going to end right here. My laptop is telling me that it needs some battery charge. So I'm going to go get my laptop cord, and I'll post another video for the next part of this, but this will get you going. So thanks for watching.